All right, we are, let me, if I can get to my file here, there we go. I want to say before I begin the actual class that I want to just go ahead and say I'm taking a mulligan for last week. We're going to just have a do-over because my plan for last week, today, and Lord willing next Sunday was a very noble plan, but it was very naive. And I realized probably 3/4 of the way or so through last week's class, this is going to fail hard. And it's just too much to cover. I really was enjoying the material. I told somebody, I've told a couple people since then, that I was like, I'm going to have to just drop back and punt and re-examine how I'm going to approach this brief overview of intertestamental period, because there's no way I'll get even remotely close to being through it. At the rate I was going, I would have needed probably 7 to 10 weeks to cover what I wanted to cover. So what I'm going to do, the good news is, I now know when I get ready to teach like a class, a quarter, I've got me a resource, because this is kind of a lot of what I was working through last week, and at that rate, it probably would be a good solid quarter of study. So I've kind of wondered about that before. In the past, people have asked about it. I was like, well, one of these days I do want to teach it. I wasn't exactly sure how I wanted to approach it, because it seems like you either get such sparse information that you go, that's really not going to be enough for a whole class, or that's more rare. Actually, what you typically get with intertestamental period is something that is so deep and so detailed that you go, this would only interest, you could only hold the interest for a very long of like PhD students. That's kind of how you feel sometimes. So, but this is such a good mix of those, this book by Pfeiffer, so I like that, and that's probably what I will use primarily, at least, when I do teach it. That said, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use virtually the same PowerPoint as I used when I did an overview of this before. I was trying to stay away from that and see if I could do kind of a little bit more in depth, but like I said, it was a noble effort, but I didn't realize what I was getting into there. It's just too much. I do want to, we mentioned before when I studied this kind of as an overview, it was sort of a bridge between the Old and New Testaments when we were doing the Book of the Month, and I called that sermon "The Sound of Silence," thinking about that song, but it's also sort of a play on words in the sense that we often call the 400, a little over 400 years between the Testaments, we often call it the silent years. Some people call it the intertestamental period. Some people call it the silent years. And the reason for silent there, that word, is because the pen of Revelation was silent. But God was not silent by any stretch. And so it's, like I said, it's kind of a play on words there, the sound of silence, because there's a whole lot going on during that time period that helps to understand. I want to contrast conditions in the situation with the Jews, and you'll see at the close of the Old Testament, at the open of the New Testament, things are very different. And that's why we cover a lot of this, because sometimes people say, well, if there's not any inspired revelation from that period, it's not part of the Old Testament, it's not part of the New Testament, why do we study it? It's more historical. It seems like it belongs more in academia, secular academics, classroom, whatever. But it has such a bearing on the New Testament. There are so many things that if you don't have some information here, you just don't really understand, because things are so different from the close of the Old Testament to the close, or to the open of the New Testament. At the end of the Old Testament, you've got the Jews under Persian rule. At the beginning of the New Testament, though, they're under Roman rule. They're part of the Roman Empire. There was no Rome at the close of the Old Testament. So how did that come to be? Well, when you began to study intertestamental period, you began to understand that. We talked last week about Cyrus and hopefully have a better understanding of him now. We got a good head start on a full study of intertestamental period, but there's so much, really even more that we could say about Cyrus, but what a great leader he was, and in many ways a very humane leader also. By the way, before I forget, somebody had asked me just a couple of days ago, somebody got in touch with me and said, could you give us maybe a list of, I think they were asking for characters or something like that. I'm working on that. I'm going to try to have something, and I'm trying to decide, part of my decision on that is, how detailed do we want to be? I'm trying to keep it where it's not going to be so many names that you just, we think in terms of, I think if I were really boiling it down, I would go, Nebuchadnezzar, right? Cyrus. I think you have to mention Xerxes, because who is Xerxes? We know him by a different name if you're reading the Bible. Esther's husband, Ahasuerus. Artaxerxes is mentioned in the Bible, not as prominent a role. So I would mention those three. You would also have to mention Alexander the Great, Antiochus, Epiphanes. I'm trying to think just main ones. And some of this I'm getting ahead of myself, but I do want to try to have something for you at the end of next week's class. Even if it's, I'd almost rather err on the side of going too many names than too few, but I'll try to keep that, reasonable. But I'm also thinking about adding some places in there. If you're talking intertestamental period, some keywords you have to remember are Babylon, Persia, Greece, Rome, those 4 world empires. But then you're also going to want to remember things like, Pharisee, Sadducee, Essene, Zealot, and things like that. So, and I'm trying to find a website that I like. There are all these different websites you can go to, and you can make these. They call them word clouds, and I think that would be kind of a neat idea to plug in several of these key words. And we'll have a separate list of them as well, but plug them in, make a little word thing for an intertestamental period word cloud. I've played around with that. I've got several, like I said, I've got a list of about 30 key phrases or key words now. I just haven't found an online word cloud creator that I like. So if anybody has one that, if you've ever done that before and you got a particular website or something, please do share. But let's go back to contrasting these Jews' conditions. Again, Persian rule at the end of the Old Testament, Roman rule at the beginning of the New. At the end of the Old Testament, they're harassed quite often and encircled. They're surrounded by their enemies. But then when the New Testament opens up as part of that Roman rule, they're under the Roman Empire, so now they're protected by Rome. No, it's very, very different. Big contrast there. You don't have a whole lot of population at the close of the Old Testament, but when you get to the New Testament, it's a very densely populated area. There are a lot of folks in the Palestinian area, and especially Jerusalem, when you open up the New Testament. Not really so at the end of the Old Testament. In fact, in Nehemiah, they're having to kind of the lots and things like that. We might use the expression drawing straws or something like that. Say, hey, we need some people to come live in Jerusalem, folks. We got to populate this city. And so having to try to get people to come and to live in Jerusalem. But, here in the New Testament, from the very get-go, there's a lot of people. I think I've mentioned this to you before. I don't know if I've mentioned it in this particular study, but from the period of the Babylonian exile, the Babylonian captivity, there will never again from that period forward be the most, trying to think how I want to say this, the most population of the Jews will never again be in Jerusalem or in the Palestinian area. They're going to be spread all over. Cyrus is going to allow the Jews to come home, right? We know that. We've already talked about that. But some of them just kind of say, no, I'm good. I've made my home here in Babylon. Some of them were still in Babylon. Of course, the captivity started in Babylon. Some of them end up in Shushan, as the Bible puts it, or Susa. Some of them end up in other places. Alexander is going to invite many of them to live in his newly founded, very Hellenistic city called Alexandria. I was going to say it's not a trick question. Alexandria. He sets this up as kind of a model Hellenistic city, and he's going to invite many of them to live there, and many of them do. But after the Babylonian captivity, you never have the greatest population of Jews in the greater Palestinian area. It's just that, and of course the term that'll often get used and thrown around is the dispersion. Diaspora, I think is the way it's put in the Greek. But it's the dispersion. They're dispersed all over. And there's a lot, even just from that helps prepare the way for the gospel and the spreading of the gospel once Jesus comes on the scene. But you see a very big difference in the population between these, end of the Old Testament, beginning of the New. At the end of the Old Testament, the cities are mostly just, rubble, heaps of rubbish. That would be obviously as a result of Nebuchadnezzar coming in and just leveling Jerusalem because he'd had enough. Later on, ironically, that's going to happen with the Roman Empire as well. So he comes in, he destroys the temple, destroys the walls, destroys the city, and so you got mostly just rubble. But then when you get to the New Testament, man, you've got well-built cities. In fact, if I'm getting ahead of myself here, but who is probably, ironically, was not a morally good person, was not even the best ruler in many ways, but it was probably his biggest contribution. Herod the Great. A very petulant man in many ways. I mean, he's going to be jealous of an infant, so much so that he's going to go out and say, we're going to kill all the infants, 2 years old and younger. Because I'm going to get rid of this so-called king of the Jews. And yet, what a contribution. One of the greatest being the temple. I mean, he made some amazing renovations to the temple that were over 40 years in the building. In fact, I was reading some more just this morning in Pfeiffer's book. It's not ha-ha funny, it's just ironic because these renovations were finished about 63 or 64 AD, which is, they got to last about 5 or 6 years before AD 70, when the Romans come in and completely level Jerusalem, and including the temple. So, wow, all those like 40 plus years of temple renovations and remodeling and whatever you want to call it, and about 5 or 6 years later, after it's finished, it's gone. Such is the way it goes sometimes, isn't it? The land at the end of the Old Testament was mostly desolate, but again, when you get to the New Testament, you've got a lot of well-cultivated land, terraced hills. Big contrast there. A lot of poverty at the end of the Old Testament. The Jews were just kind of scraping by, we might say. But when you get to the New Testament, a fair amount of generally prosperous. As far as that goes. At the end of the Old Testament, the people were pretty insignificant. They're just, just kind of trying to eke out a living in many ways. But when you get to the New Testament, you have merchants, and many of them with some significant influence. No system of jurisprudence at the end of the Old Testament, but at the open of the New, you have this Sanhedrin or Sanhedrin Council, and they have some serious influence. They have some power. That's one of the things to me that you look at these, like the Pharisees and the Sadducees. That alone, when you get to the New Testament, if you don't have any kind of intertestamental background at all, and honestly, I was trying to think about this going into like preaching school because I don't think I'd ever studied intertestamental period before that. I don't know that I'd ever just stop to think about, wait a minute, you don't read about Pharisees in the Old Testament. You don't read about Sadducees. Where did they come from? I don't think I'd ever stop to think about that. But when it came up, I was kind of like, yeah, okay, what's going on with that? And this Sanhedrin Council, what's the deal with that? I just never really given that a whole lot of thought. But, you can't answer those questions without some kind of, at least some overview of intertestamental period. No king at the close of the Old Testament. The open of the New Testament, you have this Idumean, we already mentioned him, Herod the Great, who is called the King of the Jews. He was called that by Rome. He called himself that. The Jews, I assure you, did not call him that, at least not the faithful ones. They did not consider him the King of the Jews. They're looking for the Messiah to come. Of course, when he comes, they miss him because he's not what they were looking for. And there's a lesson in that even to this day, right? So many times, even to the present, people miss the King because he's not what they're looking for. And so people look for a conqueror, and Jesus comes as a humble teacher, and so they miss him. People looking for this great this is going to throw off the Roman yoke of oppression. And here comes Jesus, and he says, my kingdom is not of this world. And they miss him. Over and over again, you see that even again to the present. We could also talk about the contrast in religion. And some of this we've touched on already. There's at the end of the Old Testament, there's just an assumption, really, throughout the Old Testament. There's just this assumption when it comes to immortality that there is life after death. That when a person dies, they're not just, as the old saying goes, like Rover and dead all over. The spirit, the soul lives on. But then when you get to the open of the New Testament, you have this clash between the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Because the Pharisees are kind of what we would probably consider, definitely would consider, they're the conservatives. Their conservatism gone to seed, actually, to the point of radicalism to binding where God hasn't bound. The Sadducees, though, they were the liberal element. Even to the point of they didn't believe in the resurrection. They don't believe in the resurrection. They don't believe in spirits. They don't believe in angels. And in fact, on one occasion, they come to Jesus and they think they got a conundrum here, right? And they say, well, in the law of Moses it says if a man marries a woman and he dies without having children, then his brother is to marry her and he'll raise up children in his brother's name. And so here's a man, he marries a woman, he dies, and so the brother marries her. Well, the brother dies. And now there's another brother. And it's 7 brethren, 7 brothers marry this woman, and they all die, leaving no heir, no seed. And of course, we've said before, I think if I was that 5th, 6th, or 7th brother at least, I'd kind of say no thanks. But they got this conundrum for Jesus. Okay, you believe in the resurrection, Jesus? So whose wife will she be in the resurrection? And of course, Jesus says, you do err, not knowing the Scriptures nor the power of God. In the resurrection, they're like angels. They don't marry, they're not given in marriage, but they're like the angels of God. So, next point on that. On another occasion, he makes a point with the Sadducees just on the tense of a verb, right? Well, what was that argument? Goes back to a statement God made. Do you remember this? I am the God of... It's actually the same context, isn't it? I've said another occasion. So check me out on that. I think was it Matthew 22, right? But he says, I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Now, what's the argument that he's making there? It's not the God of the dead, but of the living. It's interesting. Sometimes people will say, Jesus was a good man. But he wasn't the Messiah. He wasn't God in the flesh. That's, sometimes skeptics and folks that don't want to believe in anything miraculous or whatever, they'll say, look, I'm not denying the guy was a good teacher, okay? But God in the flesh, come on. Well, look, he was either a filthy liar because he says, I am God, the Son of God. I'm God in the flesh. So he's either a filthy liar or he is just stark raving crazy, or he is who he claimed to be. But get rid of this garbage of, well, he was a nice guy and he was a good teacher, but just not the Son of God. Are you kidding? If a guy comes and says, everybody listen to me, follow me. I am the way, You can't go to heaven except through me. You have no hope beyond this life except through me. And that's not who I am, and it's not true. I'm not a good person. I'm a liar. Or, bless his heart, he's crazy. He's just a lunatic. And he needs some serious professional help. Well, we know Jesus was not a lunatic, because stuff like this very point that we're making here, did somebody find it? Was I right about that 22? I'm doubting myself. I'm in Matthew 22 here. Yeah, it is the same. Yeah, it's the same context. That's what I wanted to be sure. I originally said it was another occasion. But here, he's not a lunatic. This is just one example of many we could give. He makes a very precise argument about God and about the afterlife simply based on the tense of a verb. God says, I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. Not I was. He's not the God of the dead. He's the God of the living. There are times when Jesus' logic, they bring to him the coin, or they come to him asking him, should we pay taxes or no? They think they got him on the horns of a dilemma there. Bring me a coin. Whose image is it? Caesar's. Well, you render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's. Render to God the things that are God's. Man, they're just stumped. He wasn't crazy. So that leaves only either he's a liar or he's Lord. And again, the evidence is there. Jesus, he was not crazy. He was not a liar. He is Lord. But the option of, well, he was just a good person, a good teacher, but not the Messiah, that's not even open to us. Don't be ridiculous. So at the close of the Old Testament, you have that assumption, and at the opening of the New Testament, you've got this whole group, and they're a powerful group, that they don't even believe in spirits or the resurrection or angels. Synagogue worship was unknown, obviously, under the Old Testament. We talked about this a little bit last week, I think, because when you get to the New Testament, there are synagogues practically everywhere. They're all over the place. You didn't have that in the Old Testament. Very centralized worship. The Canaanites and the inhabitants of Palestine before Israel came in, they were very much all about these localized deities. And God always was saying, his people were going to have this centralized location. When you go into captivity, that's not an option. And so synagogue worship begins to pop up. And we talked about a lot of similarities to even the New Testament worship. But boy, they're all over the place when you get to the New Testament. In the Old Testament, when you close out the Old Testament, you have this temple that is inferior to Solomon's. You may recall that when they kind of laid the foundation, there's an older generation that weeps. They cry. Why? They remembered Solomon's temple and how magnificent it was. And they're kind of basically crying because they say, this just doesn't hold a candle. And it's interesting because, in that text, you got the younger generation, they're celebrating. Hey, this is great. They're kind of shouting for joy. We're laying the foundation of the temple. We're rebuilding the temple. The older generation is crying because they say, well, it's great, but, it's not anything compared to Solomon's. And so you can't distinguish, it says, the one from the other, because they're all just wailing. So, but then you get to the New Testament and you have this temple that is really, we would have to say, in many respects, even superior to Solomon's. You had the temple area proper where the priest operated, and you had the holy place and the most holy place. But he also makes like this terrace, these terraces, and so people could get closer. There was an area for the women. There's an area for other folks that are not, they're not authorized to go and serve as priests. They can get a little closer to the temple area proper. And then there was an area for the Gentiles, the court of the Gentiles. That also would include somebody who was ceremonially unclean, therefore unfit to approach the temple. Just magnificent temple structure that Herod had built. At the close of the Old Testament, there is no such thing as a feast of dedication. By the way, what do we know that better as? Probably not Pentecost, Hanukkah. There's no Hanukkah celebration in the Old Testament. But when you get to the New Testament, there is. And not only that, Jesus actually attends it. So, it was not something that was frowned upon by deity as far as, this should not be happening. But, where does that come from? You don't understand that if you don't have some kind of a idea of between the testaments, the history there. Intermarriage was a big-time problem at the end of the Old Testament. In fact, Nehemiah, you recall, that's one of the reasons we say that Nehemiah, it's not the last book of the Bible as far as the order of the books, last book of the Old Testament as far as the order of the books, but chronologically, probably Nehemiah's work would be the end of the Old Testament. And the reason for that is because he goes to rebuild the walls, and they get that done, and he had agreed that he would return to the king. And so he did, and then sometime, we're not exactly sure how long, but sometime later, he came back to Jerusalem, and he found that everything had just kind of fallen apart. They'd gone back to a lot of their bad ways, and one of the problems was intermarriage. So he's going to deal with that. Ezra had to deal with that. It was a constant problem, but you don't really have that problem when you get to the New Testament. It's interesting because, again, getting ahead of myself a little bit, one of the things that we've pointed out numerous times before is that what was the primary reason, if you're going to boil it down to one word, the primary reason why Israel and Judah both were destroyed and went into captivity? Idolatry. And that's what it comes down to. And Brother Cates used to use the expression all the time, and it always made me laugh, and I think about him every time I think about this. Brother Cates said, it's like God said, I'm going to stop that dog from sucking eggs. And when they went into captivity, he broke them of idolatry. And he says, I'm going to break you of this idolatry. And buddy, he did. I mean, to this day, it is hard when you go down to the Biblical History Center in LaGrange, and they've got all these artifacts from the Palestinian area. One of the things that they cannot find in there, archaeologists can't find, is an intact idol. Because after the captivity, they were so intent to repent of this, they destroyed them all. But a new struggle arises after they come back from captivity, and it takes a few years, but the biggest struggle leading up to, and right there including the New Testament when it opens, is the struggle against, we would kind of say modern day equivalent be just kind of general worldliness, pop culture. And the pop culture thing of their day was Hellenism. These Greeks, they build these elaborate gymnasiums, they'd exercise completely in the nude and do these things that were just, ungodly, they're immodest, and a lot of the Jews, especially as the younger generation comes along, they kind of go, oh man, that sounds interesting. I want to get involved in that. And language, intermarriage, even to some extent becomes a problem. But when the New Testament opens up, at least, that's not as big of an issue. A lot of that struggle has taken place. Some of it is still happening in the opening of the New Testament, but a lot of that struggle with Hellenism, it actually occurs during this period. I shared this image with you before with Galatians 4 and 5. I really like this. I don't know. I was looking, you can see kind of here is a pharaoh. There's a lot of background here. You have to kind of study this picture to get some of the stuff. There's some naval action here. I thought I had picked out another individual. But anyways, it's just pointing out you got a cavalry soldier right here. But just pointing out, that when the fullness of time had come, God sent forth His Son, made of a woman, made under the law, King James says, to redeem those who were under the law, that we might receive the adoption of sons. It's all about this whole intertestamental period, really all Old Testament history. We've said that numerous times during that study. It's all getting us to the Messiah. It's all about Jesus. History is His story, as we've pointed out numerous times. The image of Daniel chapter 2, we've discussed this numerous times, that this dream that Nebuchadnezzar has, it provides for Daniel to be promoted, and he will be. It's going to give a preview of coming history, and that's kind of what we're talking about here in this context. But it's also a projection of how God is going to establish an everlasting kingdom. It's a preview of history, but it doesn't just stop there. And don't miss that when you study the intertestamental period. It's a lot of interesting history. Don't miss that, by the way, if you don't like history. Sometimes people look at it and they go, I can't stand history. It's so boring, and I don't want to talk about this. But it's His story. It's It's about Jesus. And so even if I like history, I don't need to just get so focused in on the history of it that I forget this is all about leading to that everlasting kingdom. In the days of these kings shall the God of heaven set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed. Daniel 2:44. That's what it's all about. It's all getting to that. Of course, you got Babylon, the head of gold, Medo-Persian Empire, the silver, bronze being Greece, and the iron being Rome. And so that's the empire, that fourth kingdom, fourth world kingdom, where the God of heaven would set up this eternal kingdom. The book of Daniel and God's kingdom, there's a lot we could talk about here, but most of this I think we have covered even within our Old Testament history class, and pointing out just a moment ago, even today, Babylonian, Medo-Persian, Greek, Roman empires, and then of course the kingdom of God, which was established somewhere around AD 33. That may not be exact. There's some discrepancy as far as we can tell. Jesus, we kind of date the calendar with where Jesus was born, but there's some discrepancy in the dating, so it's probably somewhere around 4 to 6 BC actually when Jesus was born. But that's a good reminder of that image. Daniel has another vision, Daniel chapter 7. You got these four beasts, again representing the four world empires. You've got the lion, which is Nebuchadnezzar. Got those wings, a swift rise to power, of course. Later on, the wings are going to be plucked from off of this lion, meaning what? Yeah, he's humbled by God. That's Daniel chapter 4. He had to learn that the Most High ruleth in the kingdoms of men and giveth it to whomsoever he will. He was lifted up from the earth, seems to be his pride as well. A man's heart was given to him. Then you got the Medo-Persian Empire, mentioned like a bear is the animal that's used to represent that empire, raised up on its side. Remember, it kind of began with the Medes dominating, and later on the Persians are going to come out on top, and it'll be just referred to as the Persian Empire. 3 ribs in his mouth. I don't think we've talked, at least not in this class, about the 3 ribs. I think I mentioned this with Cyrus last week, but does anybody recall the 3 kingdoms that there were 3 other world powers that he took out? We know number 1 is who? Babylon. Egypt, and actually Cyrus' son, Cambyses, will finish off Egypt. And the other one was, anybody remember? Lydia, yeah. Oh, duh. Oh, it is. You cheated. You knew it anyways, right? I was like, man, y'all are they got it. They're sharp. That's funny. I did not even see that, but yeah, there it is, right on the slide. Those are the 3 ribs in the bear's mouth. He was told to arise, devour much flesh. Of course, that's what Cyrus and the Persian Empire did. They went and they really spread even farther than Babylon. And then, of course, you got the leopard, which would represent the Grecian Empire. 4 wings on this creature, a very swift rise to power. You may recall that from Alexander. We'll talk about him later on. 4 heads. Why 4 heads? Yeah, Alexander's not going to leave an heir. He had married a woman, and she was pregnant, and his heir, I guess if you wanted to call it that, he had never named an heir, but it would have fallen to his son. But he was born posthumously and was subsequently murdered, as well as his wife or widow. She was also murdered by one of these 4 men, generals, who's going to step up and take Alexander's kingdom. And it's interesting because what will happen is when Alexander dies and he leaves no heir, and those 4 heads, those 4 generals that eventually rise, and there's going to be constant fighting between them. There is no world power for a long, long time there. And there's, with Babylon, even going back to Assyria, you see that's the power. They're the world power. They're the ones you got to fear. Babylon starts to threaten it. Babylon eventually becomes dominant. They conquer Assyria. Babylon's the world power. Well, then here comes the Medes and the Persians, and And then Cyrus really becomes the world power. And Alexander, he's 26 years old, he's conquered the world. And even went as far as the Punjab region of India. Why didn't he not go any further? Does anybody recall this from secular history? His army says, no mas. We're not going any further. They were done. They were just, I don't know if they were homesick, missing their families, I don't know. But they just said, we're not going any further. So Alexander says, okay. So he's that's as far as his conquest went. But when you get to Rome, finally you see a reunification again, and all the infighting and things like that stop, and you have a world power once again. And boy, does Rome become a world power, right? I mean, you know that even from, just grade school history. But this fourth beast was, different from the others. It's just called like the diverse beast, I think is the way the King James puts it. It's not really like any other beast, and this is some artist rendering of it. What is it called? The Knowledge of the Truth. I think it's a website I found this on. Well, we don't know exactly what it looked like, but it was different than anything else. But it was an exceedingly dreadful, terrible beast. Iron teeth, brass nails, 10 horns, a little horn which plucked 3 horns. And of course, if we had more time, we could talk about all the symbolism there. But that's meant to represent Rome. Dreadful, strong. Again, the iron in the legs. Each metal getting less valuable but stronger. What a strong empire Rome turned out to be for a long, long time. Babylon. Talk a little bit about Babylon. We've covered most of this already, so I'm going to move quickly through this. The background of the Samaritans actually goes back to Assyria's capture of Israel. We talked about this, 2 Kings 17. This was covered in our Old Testament history, so again, I won't spend a lot of time there. In Babylon, the Jews no longer had their temple. By the way, the whole thing with the Samaritans, before Cyrus, nobody let captives go home. Nobody left people in their land and left some of the natives in their positions of authority, but Cyrus would do that. But what you would typically do is you take a huge portion into captivity, transplant them somewhere else, and then you bring other people in there and transplant them in the conquered land. That's exactly what Assyrian king, Sennacherib, thank you. That's exactly what Sennacherib did. And he transplanted people there, and so they start having issues, and they say, oh, well, it's because we're not respecting the God of this land. And when you read that in 2 Kings 17, your first thought is, oh, good, they want to seek God. They want to seek Jehovah among many other gods. And that was the problem. And so the Samaritans are actually going to establish their own. They got, if you ever heard people talk about the Samaritan Pentateuch? They had this corrupted version of the Pentateuch where they would change references to Zion or Jerusalem and change it to Mount Gerizim, because that's where they had their temple. And so they constantly, and that's why when you get to Ezra and they start to rebuild the temple, and these Samaritans come and they say, hey, we're going to help. And Ezra's real strong against them and says, you don't have any part in this. And when you read that, have you ever read that and thought to yourself, that's kind of mean? Why is he being like that? I mean, they want to help. Now, they want to seek God among others, and this is not like, oh, we want to serve God. And they had ulterior motives as well. So that's kind of some of that Samaritan background. You see some of that clash, even why there's that clash even down in the New Testament. But in Babylon, they didn't have the temple anymore. They couldn't attend the temple to worship. It decentralized worship, and that's where synagogues began to pop up. And when they return home, they bring synagogue worship home as well. They still had the centralized temple area when they come home, but synagogues are all over, even as far as Babylon, Shushan, but Jerusalem always maintains the primacy. Primacy? How do you say that? Primacy, okay. For some reason I want to say primacy, but I didn't think that sounded right. But not everybody returned home, so the synagogues were in other places as well. 10 heads of Jewish families were required to establish a synagogue, more if it's a bigger city. And then in the first century, what you're going to find is the synagogues mean a ready-made audience of Jews. And in synagogues, any Jew who was present, sometimes they'd say, oh, Brother Bob, do you have a word of exhortation? And so sometimes a man named Paul was sitting in those assemblies, and they'd say, hey, you got a word of exhortation? And he would say, yes, I do. And he'd get up and start talking to them about Jesus. And sometimes they were interested and they'd say, want to hear more. And sometimes they'd say, get out of here. We don't want to hear this. But it made a ready-made audience. Let's stop there, and then we'll pick up next Sunday, Lord willing. We'll talk about Persia and kind of wrap all this up. And like I said, I'll try to have you kind of a list of some key characters. But I'm looking forward to a more detailed study of this in a full quarter before too long. Thank you very much. We'll have a break before our worship period.